He was always in his jeans and button shirt, hat, and always, always had a tool in his hand.
Somewhere around 1963 or 64, I actually met the great Charlie Bovey. It was in the Star Bakery in Nevada City. And my mother and I were sitting over at a table, and Charlie came in. I actually had a conversation with him, and he let me record the music machines on my little tape recorder. On March 15th, 1972, Charlie Bovey called up my house. He says, "Come on down to his office and we'll go out to lunch." So I went down there, and at lunch he hired me. So I guess I'm still working for him. Charlie Bovey was a very rare and unusual individual. A wealthy man who spent most of his fortune on restoration and preservation of history. Charles Bovey's family were involved with the milling industry with Washburn Crosby Company in Minneapolis. Their major thing that they did was make gold medal flour in the old days. Eventually they made Wheaties and a lot of other things. Charlie was always very interested in old things, and even when he was a little kid, he collected buggies, wagons, things that his family didn't really approve of. In 1926, Charlie Bovey had graduated from Andover Academy, and instead of going on to college, he elected to learn the milling trade. And was quite surprised when his father sent him away to Great Falls, Montana to work in the Washburn Crosby mill there, the Royal Mill. Charlie started out as a sweeper in the mill, which I guess was sweeping up the grain dust and such. After 3 or 4 years of reporting to work every day at exactly the right time and having somebody looking down his neck all the time, Charlie decided to grow wheat. Charlie grew wheat on a acreage east of Great Falls that he had at first rented from his girlfriend's father, who happened to be the president of the Great Falls National Bank, Lee Ford. His girlfriend was Rachel Sue Ford. Charlie and Sue hit it off well together because of their love of history right from the beginning. They continued on doing mainly wheat ranching on their own east of Great Falls. In 1940, Charlie Bovey attended a horse sale in Fort Benton, Montana, and he met the daughters of Joseph Sullivan, the saddler, who was deceased by that time. And instead of going to the horse sale, he went to the old saddle shop where these daughters showed him through. He got so interested that he forgot about the horse sale altogether. And the daughters were so impressed by him that they gave him their father's saddle shop. Charlie had to take the building down. He was going to build it at his ranch, but the Great Falls Fair Board suggested that he build it at a big building that was on the Great Falls Fairgrounds, and he built it inside there. It was such a popular thing at the 1941 Great Falls Fair that other people gave him old buildings to move into that place and build an indoor town. He called this town Old Town. It had quite a number of buildings, from Elkhorn, a big house eventually that he found down here below Nevada City. The Sedman House was in it, and a saloon, blacksmith shop, big general store, and so on. And that became a very authentic and full-scale museum of buildings. Charlie had by that time collected a lot of antiques, and this was a good place to display them. This led to interest in preserving buildings throughout Montana, and in 1944, I think it was, he founded the Historic Landmark Society of Montana. And he took a tour around the places like Bannock and a number of other spots, looking at buildings that might be preserved. And they did do some preservation. He came to Virginia City in 1944. He went on down into the old part of town and into the vacant buildings, and some of them with the broken windows and others that were just closed. And he got down to what is now the Bela Hay Saloon. He went inside, and there was somebody tearing out wainscoting in there. He says, "You shouldn't be doing this." And the man says, "What is it to you?" He says, "These buildings aren't worth anything except for firewood. Do you own this building or something?" Well, Charlie didn't, of course. He was very distraught from this. He went back up to the bus, got on, went back eventually to Great Falls. He came down and tried to convince the city council, the Vigilance Club, and so on to preserve the buildings of Virginia City. He wasn't getting very far, and he happened to meet some people that had a house for sale for $100. He bought it, and now being a landowner, he stuck around for a day or so later, and he was able to purchase a number of properties. The Elling Estates Corporation owned a lot of property down in the lower part of town, and after Charlie had bought a number of individual properties from individual people, Elling Estates Corporation's attorneys approached him and asked him if he'd like to buy a great deal of the lower block on both sides of the street, and what's now the Wells Fargo Coffee House and the Buford Store. Nice brick building. If he'd buy the brick building, they'd throw in all the rest of the properties that they owned. And so with that transaction, Charlie became a major landowner in that portion of town. In 1945, the World War II had ended and building materials were beginning to become available again. And so Charlie began stabilization of the buildings to just restore them enough so that they'll keep standing, not restoring them to where they're brand new. And this sort of a philosophy of preservation rather than restoration became a keynote in Charlie's whole career. He opened the Fairweather Inn in 1946. He opened the brewery a little bit before that, and the Bela Hay Saloon, and so on. Well, this was Virginia City. It became, of course, a major part of his and Stu's life. One of the first places they lived was in the Gilbert house. That's where they had little baby Ford. He's the only child. And they eventually bought the Rockfellow house, and they completely restored that to its Victorian elegance. And it had its own water system. It was the first house in Montana to have running water. In 1959, the Fair Board asked them to remove Old Town from the big building at the Great Falls Fairgrounds. Charlie had already purchased a part of the almost vacant town site of Nevada City at that time. There were 13 buildings left when Charlie purchased it. In order to have a place to put those Old Town buildings, he began the restoration of Nevada City starting in 1959. Nevada City grew by leaps and bounds, you might say, with not only the Old Town buildings and the original buildings, but other buildings that were donated to Charlie to preserve them. And by the mid-1960s, Nevada City was becoming a major part of the Bovey restoration tourism.
One thing I want to recall, John, is the railroad.
Oh, yeah.
You know, in 1946, after Nevada City or Virginia City was all complete and everything, Charlie decided that he needed a railroad between Nevada City and Virginia City, and so that came under construction.
There was never a railroad to Virginia City. It came down to Alder, which is only 10 miles away, in 1901. But by that time, Virginia City was but a shadow of its former self, and it would have been very prudent for the the Northern Pacific to have built a branch line the rest of the way from Alder, where they serviced the Conway Placer Mining Company, the next 10 miles on up here to Virginia City. Everything that Virginia City needed could be easily hauled in by that time by truck or something. Charlie owned the ground across the street from Nevada City. It had been dredged in the 1930s. It was just piles of rock, and since he was going to get these nice railroad artifacts, and railroad is certainly part of the history of Montana and a part of the Old West history, he had the dredge piles leveled off and brought in those rather lightweight wooden cars, which are on the track behind the Nevada City Depot at this time. The Great Northern Railroad also offered him a number of other cars in Minneapolis, and he paid the Great Northern to run them on the rails on their own wheels all the way to Alder, and then he had them put on rubber-tired house-moving rigs and moved up from Alder to Nevada City and set back on the rails there. He built a reproduction of the railroad depot in Hugo, Minnesota to standard plans. That's now the Nevada City Depot. The Virginia City Depot was a real Northern Pacific depot at Harrison, Montana, and it was moved over here to Virginia City and located at the lower end of town, where the depot would probably have been in a town like Virginia City had they actually had the railroad come into here.
When the train came into being, it was a good thing. It really brought a lot more people into town. They particularly loved the big old steam engine. And I remember the last time I saw Charlie, it would have been, probably what, I don't know, maybe a year or so before he passed away. And I had, my husband and I had returned here to renovate the old home. And I went for a walk downtown and I ran into Charlie, and we sat down in front of the Fairweather Inn and had a really kind of nice visit, laughed a lot. But I tell you, when he got up after about 10 or 15 minutes, and his walk was still very, very quick. It had slowed somewhat. But jeans, being a little bit baggy now, and the shirt, and the hat. He had a hammer in his hand, and he walked across the street, and as he walked across the street, he raised his hammer up, and I waved, and he walked down the street, and that was the last time I saw Charlie, but he was a good man.
Charlie had driven a truck up from Great Falls to here, loaded with stuff, and he came over to my house and said, would you like to go to breakfast? Well, we went to the Virginia City Cafe. Charlie didn't, as was often the case, he didn't have any money. I bought him breakfast. He had $1, he gave us a tip. And he got in the van and drove back to Nevada City. Jay Nold Midyett, the manager, wanted to talk to me for a while. I went back down to Nevada City eventually, and Sue came running out of their cabin. They were living in cabin 5 that I'd lived in, behind the hotel at that point in time, and he was having a heart attack, Sue said. I ran back there, and I was with Charlie when he actually died. I was the only one that was in there. Sue was getting the ambulance and so on. Ford soon arrived from up in town. Charlie always said, I didn't buy anything for the price to go up or for investment. Charlie bought things for the purpose of protecting it.